There was a woman I knew who had a particular way of going still, not the stillness of rest, and not the stillness of fear, though I have seen both on a human face, and I know the difference. This was a third kind, a gathering stillness, the kind that comes over a person when they have already made a decision that their mouth has not yet been informed of. She would go quiet in the middle of a sentence sometimes, mid-word even, and her hands, which were never idle in the ordinary run of things, would simply lay themselves flat on whatever surface was nearest. The table, her apron, her own knee, flat and still and waiting for the rest of her to catch up. I have been watching for that gesture in other people for 65 years. I have never seen it again. Her name as it was given to her, the name she carried into that marriage and wore for 7 years like a garment sewn too tight, was Cecilia Harmon. She was my nearest neighbor in the township of Alderton in the hill country of western Pennsylvania, and she had been my closest friend since we were girls of 11, walking the same 2 miles to the same schoolhouse, sharing a slate on the days when one of us had forgotten ours, which was usually her. She forgot the slate. I forgot the chalk. Between us, we made one adequate student. I am 87 years old. My name is Ruth Calder, née Birch, and I am speaking this into whatever permanence is available to me in the year of our Lord 1925, in a room in my daughter's house in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where I have lived for the past 4 years, and where I expect I will finish. The person who is writing this down, my granddaughter Margaret, who has her great-grandmother's jaw and her father's unfortunate habit of sighing when she thinks no one can hear, has agreed to record exactly what I say and not to flinch. Margaret, do not flinch. What I am about to tell you I have told no one, not my husband while he lived, not my children, not the minister who gave me communion for 51 years and believed, I think, that he had a fairly complete picture of my soul. He did not, no one did. What I kept from every person who knew me and loved me is this. In the winter of 1860, when I was 22 years old and the country was tilting toward a war that would break nearly everything, I helped a woman die. She did not die. That is the first thing I need you to understand. And also in certain ways the last. What I mean when I say I helped her die is this. I helped her disappear. I helped her become a woman whose name would appear in the church register under the heading of deaths, whose body would be laid out in a closed pine box and carried to the frozen ground of the Alderton Methodist Cemetery by 6 men who believed, who had to believe, who had no reason not to believe that the weight they were bearing was the weight of a woman. It was not. What they were bearing was river stone. Cold, gray, flat-sided river stone from the creek bed behind my property, wrapped in an old wool petticoat that had been Cecilia's, and packed into a box that Elias Harmon himself had paid for. I want you to hold that detail for a moment, because I have held it for 65 years, and it has never stopped being the sharpest edge of the whole business. He paid for the box. The man who made the box necessary paid for the box. Let me tell you about the winter of 1860. Let me tell you what the hill country of western Pennsylvania looks like in January, and what a woman looks like when she has been inside that landscape for 7 years, with the man who has decided that the boundaries of his property extend to the edges of her skin. Let me tell you what Cecilia Harmon looked like in the autumn of 1859, when she appeared at my door at 6 in the morning with her shawl pulled up to cover the left side of her face, and what she said to me, and what she did not say, and how I understood from the not saying what the saying alone would never have been sufficient to convey. She said, "Ruth, I need to borrow your apple press." She did not have apples. It was November. The pressing season was 2 months past. I said, "Come inside, Cece." She came inside. I put the kettle on. I did not ask about the shawl, and she did not remove it. And we sat at my table and drank our tea and talked about ordinary things. Her sister's new baby in Connellsville, the price of wool at the market in town, whether the winter would come early. She stayed for 2 hours. When she left, she took the apple press, which she returned 4 days later without comment. And I watched her walk back up the road toward the Harmon property, and I stood in my doorway long after she had gone from sight, holding the door frame with both hands because I needed to hold something. I had seen the side of her face when she left. The shawl had slipped. I did not sleep well that November. I did not sleep well that December. I did not sleep well for reasons that will become clear to you, and for reasons that have nothing to do with Cecilia at all, reasons that are mine alone and that I have carried separately in a different compartment, and that I will come to in their proper time, because I am 87 years old, and I am done with evasion, and I will tell this correctly, or I will not tell it at all. On the 4th day of January, 1860, there was a knock at my door before dawn. I was already up. I slept poorly, as I said, and I had developed the habit of rising in the dark hours and sitting with my lamp and my mending, not because I was productive at that hour, but because the act of holding something with my hands kept other thoughts from becoming unmanageable. The wood stove was going. The smell in the room was what it always was that winter. The particular smell of my black wool dress airing near the heat, because I had been in mourning since October for my mother, and the black dye in that wool when it warmed was something between a tannery and a damp sheep, not unpleasant exactly, but present, the way grief is present, always there in the background of the room. The knock was not loud. It was the knock of someone who had thought carefully about how to knock. I knew before I opened the door. I think I had known for 2 months. She was standing on my step in her husband's old barn coat, which was 3 sizes too large for her, and which she had clearly taken because it was the nearest heavy thing. Beneath the coat she was wearing her nightgown. Her feet were in her house boots, unlaced. She had walked the 1/4 mile from her house to mine in the dark, in January in Pennsylvania, in an unlaced pair of house boots and a dead man's barn coat, her father-in-law's, I would learn later. Elias had inherited it and kept it on the hook by the door, and apparently had never looked at it closely enough to notice it was gone. She was not crying. She had something in her right hand. She held it out to me, and I took it before I fully understood what it was. And then I looked down and I understood. It was a lock of her own hair, dark brown, almost black, cut close to the root. Tied with a piece of white thread, she said, "I need you to help me be dead." I stood in my doorway with her hair in my hand, and the cold coming in around us, and the black wool smell of grief rising from the room behind me, and I did not hesitate. I want to be honest about that. I have had 65 years in which I could have constructed a version of this moment, in which I paused and weighed and deliberated, in which there was a serious moral accounting before I answered. There was not. There was the length of one breath. I said, "Come inside, tell me what you need." She came in. She sat at my table, the same chairs, the same 2 women who had been sitting across from each other at tables since we were 11 years old and sharing a slate. She laid her hands flat on the surface. that gathering stillness, and she told me the plan she had was incomplete. It was the plan of a woman who had spent weeks thinking about escape and months thinking about why escape was impossible, and had finally arrived at the only solution that accounted for all the variables. She had to stop existing, not die, stop existing. Become a woman whom Elias Harmon had buried and was therefore no longer entitled to pursue. What she had was the basic shape of the thing. What she did not have was the details that would make the shape hold. That was what she needed me for. Not courage. She had courage enough for 3 women. She needed someone who would think clearly when everything inside her was roaring. Someone who had not been living inside that house for 7 years and was still capable of seeing the problem from the outside. I was that person. I had always been that person for her. What I have not told you yet, what I did not tell her that morning, though I understood it the moment she said the word dead, was that the plan she was proposing required something from me that went considerably beyond the river stones and the pine box and the forged appearance of grief. It required me to lose her, to help her become someone I could never again acknowledge knowing. To spend the rest of my life in the same township, on the same road, walking past the same stone in the same Methodist cemetery that bore her name, and to feel nothing on my face. I understood all of that. I said yes. Anyway, that is the floor of this story, or so I believed for many years. I was wrong about that, about it being the floor. I want to tell you how we built a death. Not quickly, that is the first thing to understand. The instinct when you're young and frightened and operating on the wrong side of the law in a township where everyone knows your face and your business and the name of your grandmother is to move fast. Get it done. Cecilia had that instinct when she arrived at my door. I could feel it in her, a vibration beneath the stillness, like a mill wheel turning under frozen water. She wanted to act within the week. I made her wait 3 weeks. This was not easy. I want you to understand what those 3 weeks cost, because the cost belongs in the account. Every morning she walked back up that road to the Harmon property and went inside and became his wife again, cooked his meals and kept his house, and appeared at Sunday services on his arm in the 3rd pew from the front right side, where the Harmons had sat for 2 generations. I watched her in that pew every Sunday of those 3 weeks. I sat 4 rows back on the left, where the Birches had sat for 2 generations, and I watched the back of her head and the set of her shoulders, and I looked for signs that she was failing. She did not fail. She was in that respect the stronger of us. What I was doing in those 3 weeks was thinking, constructing, taking the shape of her plan and filling it with the details that would make it hold under pressure. Because I understood even at 22, perhaps especially at 22, when the mind has not yet learned to flinch away from the full dimensions of a problem, that the plan would be tested. Elias Harmon was not a clever man, but he was a suspicious one, which is a different and in some ways more dangerous thing. Clever men look for complexity. Suspicious men look for cracks. I could not give him a crack. The problem of the body was the central problem. Everything else the story we would tell. The timing, the disposal of Cecilia herself. Everything else was subordinate to the question of what would be in that box. A coffin at a Methodist funeral in Alderton Township in 1860 would be viewed. That was simply the practice of the time and place and community. You did not bury your neighbor without having seen her, without having stood in the room with the body and paid your respects and confirmed with your own eyes what you were being asked to grieve. An unsealed box would be expected. We needed a reason for a sealed box. Cecilia gave me the reason. She gave it to me in the second week sitting at my table with her tea going cold, and when she said it, I set down my own cup and looked at her for a moment, and then I said, "That will work," and she nodded and looked at the table. The reason was this: she would be found in the creek. Not found dead in the creek, that would have required a body. Found in the creek, pulled out and dead by the time she was brought home. Drowned in January in a creek fed by Hill Country Springs. The body of a woman drowned in that water in that month. By the time anyone reached her would be, the word I'm looking for is not pleasant, but I'm done with pleasant, would be a reason to seal the box. No one would question a sealed box after a January drowning. More than that, no one would want to open it. We would not need a body at all. Only the box and the stones and the story. The stones were my problem to solve. I went to the creek behind my property on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week, when the temperature had come up enough that the ice was soft at the edges, and I worked for 2 hours in the cold, pulling flat stones from the unfrozen center of the current. I wore my father's old wading boots, which came to mid-thigh, and which kept me dry but not warm, and the cold of that water came through the rubber and through my stockings and settled into my feet and ankles, with a deep, persistent ache that I could still feel the following morning. I did not tell anyone what I was doing. I said I was gathering creek clay for the kitchen garden. No one asked. I pulled 31 stones. I weighed them on my kitchen scale, the same scale I used for flour and sugar and the medicinal herbs I grew for my own use, and I made my calculations. Cecilia weighed at that time perhaps 110 pounds. She was small-framed, and the 7 years of that marriage had taken something from her that weight does not replace. I needed the box to be heavier than empty, lighter than suspicious, and consistent enough in its distribution that 6 men carrying it would feel nothing unusual in the balance. 31 stones. 106 pounds by my scale. I wrapped them in the petticoat she brought me, an old one, plain white cotton, worn thin at the knee. She brought it without being asked. She had understood already that the stones would need to be kept from shifting. The sound of stone against pine on the way to the churchyard would have been the end of everything. I want to tell you what it felt like to hold that petticoat with the stones inside it. I want to tell you this because I have never told anyone, and because the sensation is still, 65 years later, available to me in full. The weight of it pulling at my arms, the grit of the creek stone coming through the thin cotton, the specific cold of January stone that does not warm to the hand, that takes the heat you offer it and returns nothing. I held it in my kitchen, and I thought, this is what we are offering in her place, cold stone in a dead woman's undergarment. This is the substitution we are making. I thought it was enough. It had to be enough. Now, the question of Cecilia herself. She could not simply walk away. That is the piece that sounds simple when you describe it at a distance of 65 years, and is not simple at all when you're standing inside it. A woman who walks away leaves a trail. In 1860, in western Pennsylvania, a woman alone had very few options, and all of them left marks. She could not take the train without being seen at the station. She could not hire a wagon without the driver knowing her face. She could not go to her family. Her mother was 3 years dead. Her father had washed his hands of the marriage early. Her sister in Connellsville was the first place Elias would look. She needed to be gone before the body was found. She needed to be so thoroughly gone that no subsequent looking would locate her. What I had and what she did not was a brother. Thomas Birch, my younger brother by 4 years, which made him 18 in January of 1860, 18 and already restless in the way of young men in that year, already talking about moving west, already reading the land circulars that were circulating through the county with the intoxicating specificity of promised acreage and cheap rail passage. Thomas was not living at home. He had been in Pittsburgh since the previous spring working at a foundry on the Monongahela, and he came back to Alderton at Christmas and left again on the 4th of January, which was, you will note, the same morning Cecilia appeared at my door. I wrote to Thomas on January 8th. I did not put the full truth in the letter because I was not willing to put the full truth in any document that would travel by post. What I put in the letter was this, that a friend of mine was in a difficulty, that the difficulty required her to travel west without the knowledge of her husband, that she would need someone to meet her at the Pittsburgh depot and put her on a westbound train and ensure she was safely aboard before returning to his own affairs. I said that I would explain the full circumstances when I saw him next, and that I was asking him to trust me until then. I asked him to trust me. Thomas wrote back in 6 days. He said, "Send her on the 14th. I will be at the depot at noon." That was all he said. My brother was SP3 before I had a language for it. Fact, then fact, then fact. I loved him very much. Now I had a shape that held. I had the stones. I had the box. I had a brother in Pittsburgh. I had a story, the drowning, the sealed coffin, the brief and terrible accident of a woman who had gone to fetch water from the creek in the dark and whose husband would have to live now with the question of whether he had driven her to carelessness. That question was not accidental. I put it there on purpose. I wanted Elias Harmon to wonder, for the rest of his life, whether the ice had been an accident or a choice. What I had not fully accounted for was the funeral itself, not the logistics of it. I had the logistics. I mean the experience of it, of standing in the Alderton Methodist Church in my black mourning wool on a Thursday morning in January, with the smell of that heated dye rising around me and the cold coming up through the floorboards and the sound of Reverend Phipps's boots crossing the nave, each step a slow, flat crack against the frozen wood, the sound of a man taking his time, taking his authority, taking all the air in the room for the sacred business of the dead, and knowing that inside the sealed box at the front of that church there was nothing but Pennsylvania creek stone and a cotton petticoat, and knowing that beside me in the third pew right side sat Elias Harmon, and knowing that he was weeping. I had not anticipated the weeping. I have spent 65 years trying to determine what the weeping meant, whether it was grief or performance or some combination that even he could not have separated, and I have not arrived at a conclusion, I trust. What I can tell you is what it did to me. What it did to me was this. For approximately 30 seconds, standing in that church in my dead mother's mourning dress with the coal smoke and the lanolin and the wet wool smell of 20 grieving neighbors pressing in around me, I experienced something very close to doubt, not about the plan, about my own certainty, about whether I had understood the situation correctly, about whether it was possible that the man weeping in the third pew had loved her in some broken, ruinous, insufficient way that was real to him, and whether that realness counted for anything against what I had seen on the side of her face in November. It did not. I settled that question within those 30 seconds, and I have not reopened it, but I felt it. I want to be honest that I felt it. What I have not yet told you is what happened after the service. What Elias Harmon said to me at the graveside in the cold with the box already in the ground and the frozen dirt beginning to fall. What he said and what I said back and what I observed in his face in the moment after I said it, I have not told you that. I am not telling you that yet. What I am telling you is that by 4 o'clock on the afternoon of Thursday, January the 19th, 1860, Cecilia Harmon was in the ground, and by 4 o'clock on the afternoon of Thursday, January the 19th, 1860, Cecilia was on a train. Elias Harmon had pale eyes. I want to establish that before I tell you what he said, because the eyes are part of what he said. Gray, almost colorless in certain lights, the kind of eyes that do not so much look at you as locate you, the way a surveyor locates a boundary marker with professional dispassion and a faint implied claim. I had known those eyes for 7 years, from a distance of 4 rows in a church and the polite remove of neighborly transaction, and I had never liked them, not disliked exactly. Distrusted the way you distrust a sky that is too still before a weather change. He found me at the graveside after the other mourners had moved toward the warmth of the fellowship hall. I was standing at the edge of the turned earth, standing too long, I knew it even then, standing in a way that could be noticed, but I could not make myself move. There was something in me that needed to remain at that grave for a moment longer than was sensible, some instinct I did not fully understand until later, when I had more years and more quiet in which to understand things. I was saying goodbye to her. Not to Cecilia Harmon, who was at that moment approximately 40 miles away on a westbound Pittsburgh and Fort Wayne locomotive, moving toward a life I would never see. I was saying goodbye to the version of us that was ending. The version in which we were 2 women in the same township on the same road, who sat at the same table and shared a slate, who knew each other's grandmothers and each other's grief and each other's particular way of holding a teacup. That version was in the ground with the river stones. That was the thing I was burying. I did not apprehend that clearly on January 19th, 1860. I'm telling you what I understand now from 87 years, and the particular clarity that arrives I have found only after you have stopped expecting things to resolve. Elias came to stand beside me. He did not speak immediately. We stood together at the grave of his wife for perhaps half a minute, which is a long time to stand in January in Pennsylvania, in silence beside a man you have spent years quietly despising. The cold was absolute. The sky was the color of old tin. The dirt that had been thrown over the box was already beginning to freeze at the surface, and the 6 men who had carried that box, who had carried, without knowing it, 106 pounds of Pennsylvania Creek stone, were already halfway to the fellowship hall, their breath making small clouds that the wind took immediately. Then Elias said, "She talked about you, you know." I said nothing. He said more than she talked about anyone. Ruth this and Ruth that. I used to tell her she thought more of you than she thought of her own husband. He said it without apparent bitterness. That was the thing that made it difficult. If he had said it with bitterness, I would have had something to push against. He said it the way a man states a fact he has made his peace with, or believes he has made his peace with, and the absence of bitterness made it land differently than I was prepared for. I said she was my dearest friend. He said, "I know it." Then he said, "I need to ask you something, Ruth." I had known this was coming, not those specific words, but the shape of them. I had known since the planning stages that there would be a moment at which Elias Harmon looked directly at me and asked a question, and that the answer I gave in that moment would determine whether everything held or everything broke. I had rehearsed for that moment. I had stood in my kitchen at night, rehearsing for it the way an actor rehearses. Not just the words, but the body, the face, the precise management of breath, he said. Did she ever say anything to you about being unhappy? Not. Did she seem unhappy? Did she say anything to you? The distinction mattered. He was asking whether she had spoken it, whether I was holding words of hers. I was holding so much more than words. I turned to look at him. This was the rehearsed part. I had decided weeks earlier that I would not look away, that looking away would be the crack, that a woman who had nothing to hide would meet his eyes and hold them. The pale, colorless surveyor's eyes, I said. Elias, she loved this township, she loved her home. Both of those things were technically true. She had loved the township. She had loved the idea of a home, the form of it, before she understood what the particular home she had chosen contained. He looked at me for a long moment. The wind came across the churchyard and took our breath sideways. Then he said I should have been better to her. I have been turning those 7 words over for 65 years. I have held them up to different lights in different decades, and they have looked different each time, and I'm still not certain what to do with them, whether they were genuine, whether they were the closest a man of that formation could come to confession. Whether they were, on some level, he would never have been able to articulate a question whether he knew or suspected or had some animal instinct that the box in the ground was wrong, and whether the 7 words were his way of telling me he knew, I do not know. I have decided I will die not knowing, and that is acceptable. I said, yes, you should have. And I walked away from him, across the frozen churchyard, toward the road, away from the fellowship hall, because I could not go inside and drink coffee and receive condolences over a death I had engineered, and I knew it. I walked home, the 1.25 miles between the church and my property. I walked in the cold without stopping, and I went inside and I put more wood on the stove, and I sat in my kitchen and I shook. Not from cold now. I must tell you something that is the real subject of this account, not the plan, not the stones or the box or the funeral. Those things are the apparent subject, the dramatic surface, the part that sounds extraordinary when summarized, but they are not the floor. The floor is this: I was in love with Cecilia Harmon. I have said that sentence in my mind approximately 10,000 times since 1860, and this is the first time I have said it aloud to another person, and I am 87 years old, and I note that the sentence is not difficult to say. I thought it would be difficult. It is not. It is simply accurate. I do not mean this in the way that women of my era typically meant closeness between women, the romantic friendship language that appeared in letters and diaries and was understood by all to mean a particular variety of devoted attachment that required no further examination. I mean it in the way that I understood it then, at 22, with the full and frightening clarity that occasionally descends on a young person before they have learned to manage such clarity into something more socially habitable. I was in love with her. I had been in love with her since we were 15 and walking home from the schoolhouse, and she had said something. I cannot remember now what she said, some ordinary thing about the weather or the price of something at market, and I had looked at the side of her face as she said it and understood, with the completeness of a door shutting, that I was in serious trouble. What I did with that understanding in 1853 in western Pennsylvania was put it away. There is no more complicated way to say it. I put it in a place where it did not interfere with the daily operation of my life, and I visited it occasionally in private, and I managed. This is what people did, what I did. What I suspect many people did and do and will continue to do as long as the world is arranged the way the world is arranged. When she married Elias Harmon in 1853, I stood at the back of the same Methodist church in a blue dress my mother had made me, and I watched her walk down the aisle, and I felt something that I now understand was grief, and then understood as nothing, because understanding it as nothing was the only available option. I say this not for your sympathy. I am not recounting this to be pitied by my granddaughter, or whoever else may encounter this document after I'm gone. I am recounting it because it is the only explanation for the thing I want you to understand, which is this. What I did in January of 1860 was not heroic. It was not the selfless act of a loyal friend, though loyalty was present and real. It was the act of a woman who loved another woman and could not keep her safe by any conventional means and found an unconventional one. And then this is the part that costs me still, and then she was gone. I had saved her. I had saved her completely and irrevocably. And the cost of saving her was that she had to vanish from my life as thoroughly as she had vanished from everyone else's. She could not write to me. I could not write to her. Any contact between us would have been a thread that could be followed, and Elias Harmon, I was quite certain, was the kind of man who would follow a thread. I buried my love for her in the same ground as the river stones and the cotton petticoat. And I went on for 20 years before I heard from her. I need to tell you what those 20 years were, not in detail. I did not live an extraordinary life in those 20 years. I lived an ordinary one, which is perhaps the more remarkable thing. I married a good man, James Calder, in 1863. The year after the worst of the war came through and rearranged everyone's understanding of what permanence meant. James was a school teacher from outside Greensburg, steady and kind, with a teacher's habit of listening to the end of a sentence before responding, a quality rarer than it sounds and more valuable than I understood when I married him. We had 4 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood. I kept a kitchen garden and a small flock and a household account with reasonable precision. I walked past the Alderton Methodist Cemetery twice a week for 20 years. I walked past the stone with her name on it, and I looked at it, and I felt whatever I felt, which varied by season, and by the state of my sleep, and by how long it had been since I had thought of her with any sustained attention. And I kept walking. Elias Harmon remarried in 1864, a woman from over the mountain, a widow with 2 children of her own. And I watched that remarriage with an attention I kept entirely internal, and would not have been able to explain to anyone who asked whether she was safe with him, whether I had solved one woman's problem and left the solution available to be applied to another woman in the same house. I watched for signs. I saw none that I could be certain of. I do not know to this day what that second marriage contained. That uncertainty is one of the things I carry. On a Tuesday morning in April of 1881, I went to the post and found, among the ordinary correspondence of a household, a postcard. I'm going to tell you about that postcard now. It was printed on cheap card stock, the kind they sold at railway depot newsstands in the western states during that period. Thin, slightly waxy on the printed side, with a view of something meant to suggest grandeur, and achieving instead a kind of flat, optimistic approximation of it. This one showed a mountain. I could not tell you which mountain. A large one with snow at the top and pine forest below, and a sky that the printer had rendered in a blue that did not exist in nature, but that someone had decided was the blue a person back east would associate with Western promise. I have kept that postcard for 44 years. The blue has faded now to something more honest. There was no signature. I want you to understand what it means to receive an unsigned postcard, because I think the significance can be lost at this distance. In 1881, a postcard was not the casual object it has perhaps become. It was a deliberate choice, cheaper than a letter, yes, but also public in a way a letter was not, readable by every postal handler between origin and destination. To send a postcard rather than a sealed letter was to choose a form of communication in which the message must be constructed so that it means nothing to anyone except the intended recipient. She had constructed it carefully. The message in its entirety was this: the mountain air agrees with me. I have been here long enough to know the names of things. I think of the creek often. A friend, 9 words of content, and a closing. I stood at the post in Alderton on a Tuesday morning in April with 21 years of silence between us, and I read those 9 words 4 times, and then I put the postcard in my coat pocket, and I walked home, and I went into the kitchen, and I stood at the window that faced north toward the creek for a considerable time. The mountain air agrees with me. She was alive. She was in California, or had been when this was sent. The postmark was smeared beyond full legibility, which I did not believe was accidental, but the word California was decipherable, and the date was March of 1881. She had been gone 21 years. I have been here long enough to know the names of things. She had stayed. She had not kept moving. She had found a place and learned it the way you only learn a place when you intend to remain. I thought about what that meant. A woman who had arrived somewhere with nothing, no name, no history, no connection, and had stayed long enough to know the names of things. I thought about what it had cost her to build that from the wreckage of what she had left behind. I think of the creek often. She remembered the creek, which was where we had said she drowned, which was where I had stood in my wading boots, pulling 31 flat stones from the winter current. The creek was the hinge of the whole story, and she was telling me she had not forgotten what the hinge had cost, and she was telling me she thought of it, which meant she thought of me, because I was inseparable from that creek and the architecture of what had happened. I understood all of this in perhaps 3 minutes at the kitchen window. I had spent 21 years becoming fluent in her silences. A friend, not my name, not her name, correct, careful, untraceable, and also the word she would have used in another life without any strategic intention at all. We had been friends before we were anything I have no adequate word for. She was honoring that, and she was protecting both of us simultaneously in 9 words. I did not write back. There was no return address. There was nowhere to write back to. That was the last communication I received from Cecilia Harmon in my lifetime. 1 postcard, unsigned, from somewhere in California in the spring of 1881, and then 21 more years of silence before she stopped being a woman who might still be living and became, by simple arithmetic, a woman who almost certainly was not. I want to tell you what I did with the postcard in the years immediately after it arrived. I hid it. Of course I hid it. I could hardly have left it on the mantel. But the manner of hiding is what I want to tell you, because the manner reveals something about my state of mind that I think is relevant to an accurate account. I did not put it somewhere obscure or inaccessible. I did not bury it in the kitchen garden or burn it, which would have been the sensible thing, the safe thing, the thing a woman with no ambivalence would have done. I put it inside the cover of my household accounts ledger, the ledger I opened every week, the ledger I used to record flour purchases and wool sales and the small, precise mathematics of a kept household. I put it there so that I would see it regularly, without displaying it, without anyone else encountering it by accident. I put it there the way you keep a thing you're not finished with. I looked at it every week for 11 years, until James died in 1892, and I moved the household accounts to a different system, and the old ledger went into a trunk. The ledger is in this room. It is in the trunk at the foot of my bed. Margaret, the trunk is not locked. I'm telling you this now so that you do not discover it accidentally after I'm gone and have no context for what you find. Now, I need to tell you about Thomas, my brother Thomas, who met Cecilia at the Pittsburgh depot on January 14, 1860, and put her on a westbound train, and who I had promised a full explanation the next time I saw him. I saw him at Christmas of 1860. He came back to Alderton for 2 weeks, thinner and noisier from his year at the foundry. And on the second evening of his visit, we sat in my kitchen, the kitchen that had become by then the kitchen of the Calder house, James and I having married in November, and I told him everything I have told you, and the part I have just told you about what my feelings for Cecilia were. I told him that too. Thomas listened to the end of every sentence before he responded. He had that quality too, separately arrived at from James. When I finished, he was quiet for some time. Then he said, "She got on the train." I said, "Yes, I know she got on the train." He said, "She got on the train without looking back. I watched to see if she would look back through the window as it pulled out. She didn't," I said. "That sounds right," he said. I thought about it afterward, whether that was strength or whether she was afraid to. I said, "I think it was both," he said. "Ruth, are you all right?" And I said yes, because what else do you say? And because in most of the ways that can be measured, I was all right. I was married to a good man. I was building a life with real foundations. I was managing. And Thomas looked at me in the way of a younger brother who has known his older sister since before either of them had the language to describe what they were seeing in each other. And he said, "All right." He did not press me further. I loved him very much for that. Thomas died in 1897 in Pittsburgh of a lung condition that the doctors connected to his years at the foundry, the specific particulate dust of iron casting that accumulates in a man's chest across 2 decades and eventually makes its reckoning. He was 55 years old. He never told anyone what he had done at the Pittsburgh depot on January 14, 1860, as far as I know, and I have proceeded on that assumption for the past 28 years, because the alternative is not something I can do anything about. He is the only other person who knew, the only one who took any piece of the truth about that January with them when they died. I have been alone with it since 1897. That is 28 years of complete solitude with this particular knowledge, and I want to say something about what that is like, because I think it is a thing that is difficult to imagine from the outside. It is not, as you might expect, primarily a burden. It was a burden in the early years, when the knowledge was still hot and the fear of discovery still operational, and every interaction with Elias Harmon in the township, at market, at church, on the road required the maintenance of a surface under which the knowledge was running like that creek in winter, present and moving and invisible. But Elias Harmon died in 1878, and with him died the practical danger. What remained after 1878 was not burden. It was something I find harder to name, a kind of ownership, perhaps. The knowledge was mine, and it was also the last remaining territory I shared with her, and keeping it intact was the last thing I could do for her, or for the memory of her, or for the version of us that I had buried in the churchyard along with the river stones. Every year I did not speak of it was a year I kept the faith. I am speaking of it now because I am 87, and the faith has been kept long enough, and I am the last living keeper of it, and when I am gone it will be gone entirely, which seems to me a waste of a true thing. There is one more element of this account that I have not yet given you, and it concerns the graveside conversation with Elias Harmon and what I observed in his face after I said what I said to him. I told you I said yes, you should have, and I told you I walked away. What I did not tell you is what I saw in his face in the half-second between my words and my turning. I have withheld it across 3 chapters of this account, not from strategy, but because I have still not determined what it means, and I am unwilling to present an observation I cannot interpret with confidence. What I saw was this: relief, not grief interrupted, not anger, not the face of a man confronted with an accusation. Relief, the specific, involuntary, whole-body release of a person who has been holding something very heavy and has just been given permission to set it down. I have asked myself for 65 years what he was relieved of: the marriage, the requirement to grieve correctly, the need to keep performing a version of himself that the marriage required. Perhaps all of these, perhaps something I have not thought of, something internal to that man that I had no access to and never would. Perhaps he knew I have not allowed myself to think that conclusion through to its end very often, because the implications branch in too many directions, most of them unsettling. But I will tell you that the possibility has accompanied me across 65 years like a shadow that appears only in certain lights, and that this account would not be complete without naming it. Perhaps Elias Harmon stood at the grave of his wife and looked at me and said, I should have been better to her because he was the only other person present who knew there was no wife in the grave. Or perhaps a man simply feels relief when the thing he broke is finally, formally, and irrevocably in the past. I have no way to know. I will die without knowing. What I have is the postcard. What I have is the creek. What I have is 44 years of looking at a faded blue mountain and reading 9 words that told me she had survived what I helped her survive and had found somewhere in the enormous unmapped west of this country, a place where she knew the names of things. That is not nothing. It is, in fact, the only ending this story has, and I have made my peace with it being sufficient. I have been in this room for 4 years. Not continuously. I am old, not imprisoned. And my daughter takes me to the garden in good weather, and to church on the Sundays when my joints permit the negotiation with the pew, but in the essential sense, the sense in which a person's world contracts to the dimensions they can reliably inhabit. This room is where I live now. The window faces east. In the morning, the light comes in at an angle that moves across the floor as the hours pass. and I have learned to tell the time by where the light is with a reliability that surprises my daughter, who grew up in a house full of clocks and has not yet had occasion to learn the older methods. I have been thinking in these 4 years about what it means to have kept a secret for 6 decades, not the ethics of it. I settled the ethics long ago in the only court available to me, and the verdict was not complicated. I mean the texture of it, the way a secret that is never spoken aloud eventually stops feeling like a secret and begins feeling like a room in a house that you inhabit so completely you forget. It is not visible from the street. You stop noticing the door. You stop noticing that you always close it when others are near. It becomes simply part of the architecture of the self. And then you open it. And the air that comes out is not stale, the way you expected. It is the same air it always was. I want to tell you about the creek. Not the creek as it was in January of 1860, which I have already told you, the cold current and the flat stones and the wading boots and the ache that came through the rubber and settled in my bones. I want to tell you about the creek as I last saw it, which was in the summer of 1921, 4 years before this recording, when my son Edmund drove me back to Alderton for what we both understood without saying would be the last time. I had not been back in 9 years. The township had changed in the way of places that are not quite prosperous enough to transform entirely and not quite poor enough to simply stop. A few new buildings on the main road, some of the old ones altered, the general shape of the place preserved, but the specific surface details shifted and unfamiliar. The Methodist church still stood. I did not go inside. We drove past it, and I looked at the churchyard through the automobile window. Edmund had one of the early Fords, a thing I found both remarkable and deeply unreliable, and I could see from the road the older section of the markers in the northeast corner, and I knew approximately where in that section she was, where the stones were. Edmund did not know why I wanted to go to the creek. I told him I had gathered herbs there as a girl and wanted to see it again, which was true enough to function as an explanation. He walked with me to the edge of the bank, and then, good son that he is, understood from something in my posture that I wanted to be there alone, and he went back to the automobile and left me. The creek was lower than I remembered. Creeks often are, when you return to them after decades, partly the genuine geology of a watershed changing over time, partly the inevitable diminishment of scale that occurs when you return to a childhood landscape in an old body. What was a significant feature of the terrain becomes a moderate one. What felt wide becomes merely adequate. The water was clear, running over the same flat stones, and the sound of it was the same sound it had always been, a low, continuous, untroubled conversation with itself that required nothing from the listener. I stood on the bank for some time. I thought about 31 stones. I thought about 106 pounds. I thought about the specific sensation of creek cold coming through rubber and wool and settling into the bones of a 22-year-old woman who was constructing with cold hands in moving water the logistical framework for saving the person she loved most in the world. I thought about Cecilia's hands laid flat on my kitchen table. Here is what I want to say about the creek and about the 65 years. And about all of it taken together. I want to say it plainly because I am done with any form of indirection. I do not regret it. Not the plan, not the stones. Not the lie I told at the graveside or the lie I lived for 65 years in the same township where the lie was embedded. or the particular lie of omission that constituted my entire marriage to a man I loved genuinely and completely in every dimension of myself except the one I had already given away before I met him. I do not regret any of it. I want to be careful here about what that means and what it does not mean. It does not mean I believe everything I did was without cost. It does not mean the costs were paid by me alone. They were not, and I have accounted for that to myself with the regularity and rigor of a woman who keeps careful ledgers. James Calder married a woman who was whole in most respects and curtailed in one, and he deserved better accounting of that than I was able to provide, and I knew it while he was alive, and I know it still. That is a real debt, I carry it, but I do not regret the central act. She was alive in California in 1881, and she knew the names of things, and she thought of the creek. That is what the plan produced. That is what 31 river stones and a sealed pine box and a lie told to a man with pale eyes at a frozen graveside produced. I hold that against every cost, and the arithmetic comes out the same every time now. Margaret, I'm speaking to you directly now, and I need you to put down your pen for a moment and simply listen, because what I'm about to say is not for the record. It is for you. You have your great-grandmother's jaw. I noticed it the first time I saw you clearly, which was when you were about 4 years old and you were refusing to eat something your mother had put in front of you, and you sat there with your jaw set in exactly the way my mother used to set hers, when she had decided something and that was the end of it. I looked at you across that table and I thought, there she is, the line continuing. What I want you to know is this. The thing I have told you today, the plan, the stones, the funeral, the postcard, is the dramatic version, the extraordinary version, the version that has a shape and a resolution and a California mountain on a faded postcard. The ordinary version is simply this: I loved someone. The world was arranged in a way that made that love impossible to inhabit directly. I did what I could do within those arrangements, and then I built a life in the remaining space, and the life was real and good, and I'm not diminished by it. I'm telling you this because you are 23 years old, and the world you are inheriting is not the world I was given, and the arrangements are different. And I want you to understand that the arrangements being different is not a small thing. It is not an incidental thing. It is the thing. And I want you to know it from someone who lived inside the other arrangements for 87 years and is telling you plainly from the far end of that experience, the space remaining after impossibility is not nothing. You can build in it, but you should not have to pick up your pen. I have a few more things to say, and then I'm finished. The Alderton Methodist Church still has Cecilia Harmon in its death register. I know this because my son Edmund went inside while I stood at the creek, and he found the register in the vestibule where such things are kept, and he looked because I asked him to, and he confirmed that the entry is still there. November of 1859 for the birth registration when she and Elias were married and their ages recorded, and January 1860 for the death. The ink has faded, the entry is still legible. She is still dead officially in Alderton Township, Pennsylvania. She has been dead for 65 years in that register, and alive for at least 21 of those years in California, and I do not know about the remaining 44, and I have made my peace with not knowing, though peace is perhaps not precisely the right word. Accommodation, I have made my accommodation with not knowing. I want to tell you about the postcard one final time, because I want this account to end with it rather than with anything else. After James died in 1892, when I was reorganizing the household accounts and the old ledger went into the trunk, I did not put the postcard in the trunk with it. I kept it out. I put it in the drawer of the small table beside my bed, where it has been for the past 33 years, through 4 different bedrooms in 3 different houses, traveling with me the way certain things travel with a person. Not packed deliberately with the important things, but appearing in the new place because you carried it in your hand rather than your trunk, and so it arrived before everything else. It is in that drawer now, in this room. In my daughter's house in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, in the year 1925, 65 years after a woman I loved laid her hands flat on my kitchen table and told me she needed to be dead. The mountain on the front has faded from that impossible printer's blue to something the color of a winter sky, in Pennsylvania gray-white, without pretension, closer to honest. The message on the back is still legible. I have read it so many times that I could reproduce it in my sleep, and have in fact done so more than once, woken in the dark with those 9 words running through my mind in her handwriting, which I would recognize anywhere, which she had altered into careful anonymity, but which I would recognize anywhere. The mountain air agrees with me. I have been here long enough to know the names of things. I think of the creek often. A friend, I have read it so many times, the cardstock has gone soft at the edges, the way paper goes when it has been handled with regularity across decades. The corners have rounded. The surface on the back, where the message is, has taken on the specific warmth of something that has spent a long time near human hands. That is the endurance object, Margaret, if you're thinking in those terms. That is the thing that outlasted everything else. The plan and the funeral and Elias Harmon and James Calder and Thomas and the Alderton Methodist Church's death register and 65 years of keeping a door shut in the house of myself, a postcard from a mountain in California in a handwriting I would recognize anywhere. It has no opinion of what I have told you today.
In conclusion, Ruth Calder passed away in the spring of 1926, just a few months after this recording was archived. She spent 65 years watching the seasons change over a grave she knew was empty, a silent witness to a life that ended so another could begin elsewhere. While the narration and this intimate 1925 recording are authentic historical accounts, the visuals were created using AI to help illustrate the atmospheric tension of that frozen winter in 1860. If this story of radical loyalty moved you, please subscribe to the channel and share your opinion in the comments. Do you think the postcard she received 20 years later was a fair trade for the decades of silence Ruth had to maintain?